plenty of ground to follow up in light of what we've heard. So you've all got your thinking caps on, I take it. Great. Someone has to draw the short straw, and guess what? It's you, Gemma. Someone has to do it. But look, let's focus on the employee experience. COVID-19, it changed everything, people working from home or in the office, perhaps somewhere in between. But how is and has the employee experience changed? Because I guess you've got to manage these different strands and somehow keep the machine turning smoothly.
Indeed, indeed. I think it's changed pretty dramatically, actually, right sort of from end to end in terms of an employee experience. If you think about the moments that matter when an employee is with a company, when you're with your own companies, from the point where you join a company to the point where you leave a company. During that COVID-19, I myself, in fact, not just anyone here, but I myself, in fact, had somebody join my team. I interviewed them remotely, they joined my team, they worked for me for a year and a half, and then they left. I never met her once. And that is an incredible change in the way that we hire and we manage our workforce. Part of that, though, means that we must focus on well-being, we must focus on engagement, we must focus on how to keep our workforce motivated in ways that we've never thought about before, all of which needs to be driven in a remote-first thought process. You know, what can we do from a technology perspective? How can we make work and engagement easier? So I think it's safe to say that it has fundamentally changed. We're starting to see people come back to work now, and I'm pleased to see that kind of hybrid approach and not going back to where we were before, but I'm incredibly excited to see what happens next with the workforce and how we can utilise that COVID-19 experience to really
I talked about this a bit earlier in the day about the new normal, and that is part of the new normal. And I wonder, Keelan, whether what you've heard from Gemma resonates with what you're seeing.
Yeah, sure. So taking what my company does, which is intelligent automation, taking the lens of that into how that's changing the workplace, agnostic of COVID, working from home or working in the office, that ability to take the rules-based repetitive work out of the average employee's experience, that they're able to concentrate on the value added, the things that, the moments that matter to employees, right? Outside of the moments that matter to customers, that's what's really driving a transformation in employee and customer experience at the moment, and you know, we're only seeing that accelerate. And so the more that our platform and indeed the whole category gets adopted, the greater that we're making work more human and less robotic.
And Chris, what do you see as the reality of these changes if we actually focus on resources, technology, and of course support?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here today. So I think that for me, the reality of the changes really come down to kind of the individual business. I think it will differ depending on the business. And I think there are probably two questions that we can ask in order to try and understand and ascertain what that difference is going to look like. The first is, how far along were the business on their journey towards a modernised workforce before the pandemic? And the second is, how quickly were they able to adapt once the kind of relevance of what was happening in the pandemic became clear? Because I don't think that a modernised or a changed workforce was caused by the pandemic. I think what it did was actually accelerate the process.
So the changes were already underway anyway.
Exactly that. And I think, you know, if you look at a business like ours at N26, we were very much pretty set up with tech-first, kind of remote ways of working. But the pandemic did force us to make some changes. So things like our learning development platform, how could we enrich that? So although our IT guys would tell you that shipping out hardware to all over the world was a key difference. So I think when we look at those changes, there are fundamental things which depend on the business. But I think one opportunity which has come out of it for everybody is the fact that we can start to source our employees from a broader area. So we can look at candidates that we couldn't necessarily look at before, with different skill sets, with different life circumstances. So I think that one change which really has come through is a change in diversity. And I think that that's something which we can all, irrespective of where we were before, certainly adopt and drive forward.
Sure, Dee and I, another one of these ideas, concepts that just come up post-COVID. But look, at the end of the day, Gemma, there is an impact on expenditure, you know, because all these changes, et cetera, which are happening. So the question has to be, look, does this mean that banks are looking to relocate to lower cost locations now that teams can work more flexibly? So the great office in central London, which is costing you an absolute arm and a leg. We don't need it now because it doesn't require as many people to man it.
Gosh, what a topic. Yes, indeed. It is about cost, actually, but there's several ways we can meet our cost, and offshore locations or lower cost locations, which I don't actually like the word, to be honest. I think there is an optimal location for the skill in which we need to source. But I think the key thing on that is once we start to understand our work through a skills lens, once we really understand the demand for the future, what do we need to build, what skills do we need, what do we have on the ground today, where's the gap? Once we actually fully understand that and appreciate that, we can then start to look at across the globe, where can we source those types of skills from? And it might indeed be lower cost location. But actually, it's about collaboration in the main. So how do we use the technologies to collaborate digitally? How do we use the space, the expensive space that we've got, to the best use? How do we make sure that we can have that time together to innovate and ensure that when doing so, we don't need excessive headcount on the ground, and we optimize our costs through that collaboration, through that innovation, and through that better way of working, and really listening to what we need by way of skill. And for me, if we can get that longer term view, if we can see what's around from a location perspective, and if we can hone in with what we need from a skills perspective to deliver our investment portfolio for our customers, then that will dictate the locations. And frankly, that's when we're going to meet our cost objectives.
Okay then, let's broaden things out. I mean, you touched on this, Gemma, at the beginning in the very first answer. I want to look at supporting and empowering employees, regardless of whether they're working from home or they're working a couple of days a week in an office, regardless of where that is, be it the fancy central London location or a bit further afield. But Chris, we can talk about supporting and empowering staff, but how should banks themselves go about identifying where those employee support needs strengthening? It's very easy to talk about it, but you may find it's probably the need is greater in one part of the business compared to another.
Well, I think the question itself is very interesting. And unfortunately, my answer is not going to be particularly revolutionary. How do we go about identifying those areas? Ask your people. I think that what we've done for so long, particularly in traditional banking, is we've created the structure, we've created the format, we've created this is what success looks like within banking, and then we've asked everybody that wants to be involved to contort their lives to fit our structures. And I think that what we have the opportunity to do now that there is this break, is to actually reverse that, to actually ask people where they want the support and how they want to see it. And I think that if you look, what seems to be universally true coming through, certainly from what we're hearing, is that people very much want to focus on an organisation that gives them purpose, an organisation that gives them authenticity, a sense of belonging, a sense of trust. And I think that with that being universally true, that's fundamentally how we have to look at what we're doing to shape and strengthen. And I know that kind of within our team, and I asked the team where they needed support, it brought back a whole range of different areas and personas and things that we were able to gather, because not one size fits all. It's not going to be one type of area of strengthening. I think that's the other thing which we've been able to recognise, that depending on where people are in their career journeys, depending on what the job they're doing, depending on where they are in their life, the way they need support is different. So by asking the question rather than presuming to know the answer, it's certainly kind of been far more beneficial, and that's what we'd recommend.
Yeah, you need to get the approach right, because we have to consider that some people perhaps don't want to come clean about what they think or feel. They may feel that perhaps it's going to be counterproductive, it'll be used against them, that sort of thing. But we seem to be moving away from that culture. But Keelan, come into the conversation here, because look, Chris has explained what needs to be done, reaching out to people, getting them to talk so that you can define what their needs are and you can respond accordingly. How can automation and digital tools help in that response whilst you're also trying to streamline processes?
Sure. So I think we're all seeing the headlines in the news. We're living in an era of a great resignation. People are all evaluating their life choices, their work-life balance, and looking for more from their employment than just what they've had in the past, which is get what you're given, really. I think it's very much a market where people are feeling very confident about moving jobs, and that's creating a retention issue for people. I think we're about to see the promise of the intelligent automation industry, which those of you, you all work in banking, you'll have seen the headlines from intelligent automation vendors, mine included, talking about how we're going to take the robot out of the human, but we're really starting to see that at scale now. There are millions of hours of mundane, drudgerous work being done by intelligent automation vendors throughout almost every bank in the world. But that's up till now been concentrated in the back office, really big end-to-end processes at huge volume, touching a relatively small amount of people within the organization, but transforming that. So lots of end-to-end processes, lights out in a data center. But we're starting to see a really new emerging trend of digital assistants. So not Alexa or Siri, but actual robots on your desktop able to do the 5-10% of work for everyone in an organization. So previously, footprint of intelligent automation has been high impact on a small number of people. And we're starting to see now the top 10 banks that are our customers around the world are starting to adopt thousands of digital assistants for maybe half of their staff. And then starting to take all of that mundane, repetitive work, and that then starts to transform the work experience. And so we've got quotes from top 3 US bank. Gentleman's got 20,000 attended robots within his organization, aided by things like AI, document understanding, that real ability to extend the range of what's possible and take all of that type of work out of the hands of people. And so once you get that type of footprint across an organization, you're starting to realize the promise of our technology, which is to transform work.
Sure, well, it frees up time as well if you're not bogged down with the drudgery.
Absolutely.
Okay, I mean, look, Gemma, let's look at technology supporting employees at your organisation. Where have you used it, and what are the tangible results that you've seen coming out of it?
I mean, we're seeing it implicit in almost everything we're doing now. And I really liked your point earlier, Keelan, about taking the drudgery out of work. And actually, that's exactly true. It's about looking at what's repetitive, what can we sync up, box up, and then hand over, such that our employees then get the right kind of work to stretch their mind, get involved, give them purpose, feel like they're adding value every day rather than entering from a data perspective each time. And it is an interesting concept because whilst we try and do that automation, that robotic and that AI, there is a feeling of threat to that employee that we have to protect, which is the first point I wanted to make. But actually, I brought my iPad up here because I didn't want to misquote being from NatWest, but there are a tremendous amount of things that we're doing at NatWest. And one of the things, or a few of the things that I actually wanted to just bring out, especially around the RPA stuff that you just mentioned earlier, business process management and intelligent document processing. We've actually seen a £9 million cost reduction and a 400 FTE reduction in those types of processes. So I fronted that conversation with the point about people. 400 FTE reduction, looking on two sides of the fence could actually be incredibly concerning if you're working in that type of environment. But you know what? Those people have now gone on to do different things within the organisation. They've actually been trained up and reskilled to do other things within the organisation. And that's the crux and conversation that we should be having around RPA, business process management, etc. A couple of other little nuggets for you. We're now, through digital payment initiation, authentication and approval, saving 300 sheets of paper each year. 300,000, sheets of paper each year, and approximately 500,000 minutes of processing time when we look at processing fin crime, bereavements and payments. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The point being is the processing part, the data entry part, the things that people find mundane, boring and drudgery are now able to be taken by automation, and giving those guys now the next step to a better, more meaningful, purposeful career.
And Chris, it clearly resonates with you. I mean, I don't expect you to replicate Gemma's results, but I mean, again, are you seeing improvements along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we look at the types of technology that we've been using and leaning on more heavily, the first one I think is probably, based on what I said earlier, going to resonate, and that's more around employee listening, employee sentiment. That's not Big Brother. We're not kind of dipping into everything. What we do want to understand is when we ask, how are you feeling now? What does this look like for you? How does we support your career development? We don't just ask the question once, hands off. What we want to continue to do is to get that continuous feedback, to continue to listen and understand. So I think that the first area that we've really kind of developed throughout the pandemic has been our employee sentiment. The second, and I think this would be true for everybody in the business, has been around our communication tools. So I think that we all had various forms of communication tools previously, but what we wanted to do was when you couldn't have that quick turnaround to you managed to ask, okay, so what do I do in this scenario or situation? You had kind of what was effectively the second best in that place. And then the third area for us was, how do we make sure that people still have a value, that they still feel that they have a purpose, that they can still see their own careers developing in spite of the fact that they're kind of working through a pandemic and it feels a bit more disconnected. So we've been looking at how we can really make sure that we can build tech into the organization to help with career progression, with development, with competencies, so people can still get that sense of purpose and see their own careers developing.
You've actually answered a question I was going to put to all three of you, but I mean, if you want to contribute to it, do feel free. I mean, Keelan, if we can start, I'm going to put it to you first, and then we'll just move it along. Because look, I mean, you've talked there, Chris, about young talents, but I mean, that's the point. It's how organisations can best support younger people who are joining the banks, and of course the ones who are coming up through the ranks, because let's face it, they've all been trained to expect to work in an office, a fixed environment from Monday to Friday or whatever, and of course the whole thing's been upended. So, you know, how can that support be offered in an environment which isn't fixed? It is changing.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? How do you support them?
Me or Keelan?
Yeah, we'll start
myself.
with you, and then
sorry.
Chris can add to it. I was going there for Keelan, but you can take it.
No, I mean, I think it's not actually all just the young people either. It's the career switchers, people trying to make sure that they're in the right industry for you know, future career progress. It's making sure, number one, and you'll hear our CEO talk about this all the time, the organisation must have purpose, and you must understand how you deliver against that purpose. So it's really important to understand things like, you know, objectives, key results, you know, the things that you do, how that contributes to the overarching purpose of the company. I think the other thing very much is around that level of autonomy. So when we're all under the same strategy, vision, you know, we have the communication tools, we have the technologies, etc., that we need. You know, we have the framework, I suppose. It's making sure that you allow people that autonomy to work within that framework. You know, freedom within a framework, I think we call it at work. And that really is about, when do we come to work? When should I come to work? What's the right thing for me to do, my team to do, rather than somebody at the top of house telling us what we should be doing, to your point earlier. You know, it's very much around autonomy, giving them the technology, giving them the tools, and then allowing them to actually work within that framework. And then last but not least, I think it's very much around ensuring the leaders of any business are authentic, are curious, you know, and demonstrate some of those things that people, young people in particular, look up to, role model. And that authenticity, you know, that leadership traits and that ability to really connect with people across the organisation is incredibly important from a leadership perspective. So curiosity, I think, is the word I was looking for amongst that. So yes, autonomy, making sure we have a vision and that people believe in that vision and understand how they contribute towards that purpose. And then last but not least, authentic, clear and visible leaders.
Can I have the thoughts of Keelan to that, and also Chris, before I move on to the next point of discussion?
I think Chris will be far more qualified to talk about the needs of the
Oh,
workforce.
that's called passing the buck. Okay, the buck has now been passed. You've got to run with it.
So I think one of the things I really like that you picked up on was the fact that young talent doesn't mean young people.
Yeah.
And I think that's something which we definitely have to recognise more of as an industry. I think that one of the things which we have to be doing more is actually setting very clear expectations in terms of what do we expect, how does that work, and what can you expect of us? And I think that openness and transparency around the expectations has to be super clear and defined. The second thing, which I think we have to be able to do, is to provide constant feedback. Because particularly when people are at kind of an early stage of their career, you know, you don't know what you're doing wrong unless somebody's there to actually help. You don't know how you can improve. In fact, you don't sometimes know what you're doing right unless you actually have that level of feedback. So one of the things that we've certainly tried to build is make sure you have that constant point of feedback, that somebody actually has the time to sit down and go through that with you. And I think that tying in all these key things of purpose, authenticity, trust is still team. People still want to feel, and this is not just young talent either actually, but people still want to feel that sense of team, because ultimately what you don't want is for somebody to have the ability to tick off these 4 things that they're looking for in a role, and they can find that anywhere. There still has to be something about the organisation which connects, resonates, and that they still embody. So I think that being able to put that person into that team, give them access to that, and help them see not just kind of what this job is, but what this career is and how you fit within this organisation is super important.
Okay then, before we move on to the third part of our discussion, again, the invitation to the audience, please do get involved. You've got the app, send in some questions. These guys are ready to handle anything you throw at them within reason. They are not going to tell you about the theory of relativity. You can save that for later. But look, what I want to focus on now is flexibility, transparency and trust, especially when we talk about leading the workforce of the future. So, Gemma, given those key words, talked about a great deal, thrown around in conversations, how can banks ensure that these qualities are actually embedded into their roadmaps, not just for the now, but for workforce enablement going forward?
Yeah, it's a great point, and actually quite a lot of what I said earlier really still reigns true. You know, I see it far too often: flexibility, trust, authenticity, and I said the same just a second ago, but it is actually incredibly true. And authenticity, that last piece, is actually that piece where it ties into your point around continuous feedback. We must be able to have a collaborative conversation. We must be able to have a conversation around the highs and the lows. We must be able to talk the detail, the difficult, and the future. And not enough of us do that, to be honest. And so really, in order for us to make sure that we're preparing for the workforce of the future, I think we need to, as I said, look through our portfolio of work, both now and in the future, through a skills lens. What skills do we need? What do we need to prepare for in the future? And then that then translates into how much or what and when we will invest into our employees. And actually being authentic and being transparent about the opportunities within the organisation, as well as bringing third parties into the organisation. That reskilling piece I mentioned earlier is incredibly important. People see that, people believe, people then trust, people believe there's transparency, and it is that transparency and that trust that really helps people to accelerate in their career. Like you said, continuous feedback. The point I would like to make, though, is do we ever teach anybody how to handle feedback? So I think there's a point in that in itself around managing feedback, asking for feedback, etc. And that builds trust, that builds authenticity. You know, that makes us understand, you know, who we're working with in a more detailed.
I can see that Chris is chomping at the bit to respond to that.
Very passionate. Very passionate about this.
Very fortunate, because 2 weeks ago we've just rolled out how to accept feedback. So
brilliant.
So yeah, absolutely. I actually just going to come back to the question here. I think that for me, the question alludes to the problem. And that is, for too many people, these words are simply performative, and they're not actually lived, resonating within the organisation. So I think the first thing that we have to look at in terms of what do banks actually have to do, well, fundamentally, they have to believe it. They actually have to believe that this is the right way to go, that these are things which we don't simply look at as an output, things where we can try and add colour to kind of bring people in, but it is fundamental part of who they are as an organisation, what they live and breathe. And I go back to ask their employees, do they feel empowered? Do they feel that they're trusted? Do they have the ability to make decisions and be confident in that? And where they are saying yes, build that into the hygiene of the business, make that part of your DNA. And where they're saying no, be open to that feedback, listen to that feedback, and then please do something about that rather than just sitting around another table having another conversation.
Okay then, look, I'm conscious of the fact that Keelan has been very quiet, and I don't like that, because when this guy's quiet, that means that trouble's brewing. This is why I'm going to throw this question to you. But look, we've been talking about flexible working, and on the whole, it has achieved some great results, etc. What are your final thoughts about navigating work from home or back in the office, not just for this year, but also, you know, the way ahead? I mean, what do you see as the right balance?
I think the right balance is whatever works for people, right? We've had a massive disruption to the way that we've worked. I think you hit upon it earlier that I think for those of us who are established in our careers and have the skill sets and the experience and all of the things you need to soak up earlier in your career, that's fine. We're able to adapt to that. For the younger generation coming in, there's going to be a bunch of people who need to have that in-office experience, or certainly that more collaborative experience, to learn that next set of, to develop that set of skills. So the balance is going to be, I think that's crystal ball gazing to work out what the optimal balance is going to be. I think it's about having that flexibility. I think the gentleman before us was talking about hyper-personalisation within platforms. I think we may find a bit of hyper-personalisation within working experiences now that there are the ability to have as much work from home or as much work from the office as you want, but also there's a lot more digital technology going on underpinning all of that. I think everyone will be free to choose the mix that works best for them, and I think the organisations that will thrive are those that give their employees, as well as the purpose and the values that everyone was talking about there, as Chris so powerfully said. If you've got the same 4 things you're offering as everyone else, then why would you choose me? But if you're able to offer your employees that flexibility to be who they want to be, to thrive, and give them all the support to do it, and that is going to involve that personal experience that works for you, I think the right mix is going to be a hyper-personalised mix.
Okay, that's fantastic. Look, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm afraid you're going to have to whistle through your answers. But are you ready? Because we've had some questions from the audience. Thank you so much for this. Are you ready?
Yes.
Great, no hesitation. You know the rule because I just select a victim. Okay, so let's start with this one. How are you all building key skills in technology and data roles given their scarcity in the market? Specifically, how are you pulling in diverse talent?
I'm happy to answer that one.
They're going to let you.
How are we doing it? So we're partnering considerably, recognising that, to your point, banks may be attractive to some, but not to all. And we also need to recognise that we still have a considerable imbalance of diversity from gender, ethnicity, whatever it may be. So we're partnering with some fantastic people to bring in, coding black females, for instance, code first girls, for instance, really positive, intentional, conscious steps to make sure that we are looking at that diversity with powerful next steps, commitments, and really looking at that kind of strategic view of not just today, but tomorrow as well. I could go on it for ages, but I'll let someone else speak.
That's very comprehensive. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, okay? If the right balance is whatever works for people, how do you make sure culture and values are the same for all to get the work done? Go on, Chris. All right, I'll tell you what, Chris first, and then Keelan, okay? And then we're going to have to close it out.
So great question. I think that's probably the question that everybody right now is trying to look at, because what we want to do is definitely make sure that it is hyper-personalised, that we give people these routes, but then how do we maintain values? I think that has to be top-down and bottom-up, and this is going to be kind of like a whistle-stop, but I think that if you talked about kind of OKRs, if we understand what are the company OKRs, what are the team OKRs, and how does that then relate specifically, what am I here to do, what are my challenges, and how do I contribute to the overall vision and drive of the company, I think that's super important. Again, communication. How are we making sure that people aren't working in an isolated, in a silo, that they have connections with peers as well as leadership, and create kind of a consistent and clear messaging voice around that.
Okay, that's great. Very, very briefly, Keelan. Sorry, but this has to be rounded off, and you're the man to do it.
Remind me the question again?
This was a question from a member of our audience. If the right balance is whatever works for people, how do you make sure culture and values are the same for all to get the work done?
Crikey. Well, I think the easy answer to that is that it doesn't matter where you are, it's what you produce, but it's actually a far more complex question than that, isn't it? I think understanding of, clarity around expectations for people, right? So you've got to make sure that people are being measured against the same bar, but then understanding that turning up is not necessarily a measure of success, which it probably has been in the past, so FaceTime. So I think the ability to work remote and the ability to take that work to wherever suits you best brings a lot of advantages. I think flexibility around how those metrics are measured is key, and understanding around people's personal circumstances that may lead to them turning up in a slightly different way at a slightly different frequency, but making sure that objective outcomes are measured.
That is a fantastic response. In fact, you have all given fantastic responses, not just to the questions that I've put to you, but also from the audience, and that's why I think it deserves a massive round of applause. Thank you so much to Chris, Gemma,